My cheating ex stalked me for over 50 years, even showed up at my parents' door with a knife threat. It started with innocent encounters, small run-ins at the grocery store, an unexpected message online, a glance that lasted just a little too long. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, we had been together for years, and breaking up wasn't easy for either of us. But what began as harmless curiosity soon turned into something much darker. He wasn't just an ex anymore. He became an obsession, lurking in the shadows, constantly trying to re-enter my life, no matter how many times I asked him to leave me alone. I thought I had moved on. I thought I was free, but that freedom was an illusion. When he showed up at my parents' door, knife in hand, all my old fears rushed back. I knew then that I had made a mistake trying to move on quietly. This was no longer a story of love lost, it was a fight for my safety. But why? What did he want from me? What was he willing to do to keep me in his life? I was young when I first met him, charismatic, confident, and full of promises that seemed so genuine. I never imagined that someone who seemed so perfect on the outside could have such a dark side hiding just beneath the surface. At first, our relationship was everything I could have dreamed of. We went on dates, shared secrets, laughed together, and planned a future. But as time went on, I began noticing things that didn't sit right with me. There were odd behaviors, small signs that suggested he was always watching me, controlling where I went and who I spent time with. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just how relationships worked. Maybe I was overthinking it. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, thinking that if I loved him enough, things would change. But they didn't. He became possessive, demanding, and would make me feel guilty for the smallest things. I started pulling away. I began distancing myself from him, recognizing that this relationship wasn't healthy. Eventually, I made the difficult decision to end things. When I ended the relationship, I thought I was doing what was best for both of us. I needed to live my life without him overshadowing every move I made. But what I didn't anticipate was how far his obsession would go. It wasn't long after the breakup that the stalking began. The messages started innocently enough. At first, they seemed like he just wanted closure. He apologized for everything and said he missed me. But as the days passed, the messages grew more frequent and more desperate. He would send texts at all hours, telling me how he couldn't live without me, how we were meant to be together. At first, I responded out of guilt. I still cared about him, but I knew it wasn't healthy to go back. I'd tell him to stop, to move on, but he wouldn't listen. He kept telling me he could change, that he understood now, that everything could go back to the way it was. The messages became more threatening. He started showing up at my work, lurking around the places I frequented, and even asking my friends about me. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about love, it was something far darker. He was obsessed, and I had become his obsession. But I never thought it would escalate beyond that. I convinced myself that he would eventually move on. I convinced myself that he would leave me alone. I was wrong. It was a rainy evening when I first realized the full extent of his obsession. I was sitting in my apartment, trying to enjoy a quiet night. The window was slightly cracked, and the sound of raindrops hitting the glass helped to drown out the noise of my racing thoughts. I was trying to move on, to convince myself that I was free, but that feeling of unease always lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the TV, but then my phone buzzed. A message popped up on the screen. It was from him again. I opened it hesitantly, unsure of what to expect this time. It read, "I miss you. You know we are meant to be together. I will always find a way to be with you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I stared at the message. I had told him countless times to leave me alone, but it seemed like nothing would get through to him. I put my phone down, trying to push the thought of him out of my mind, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft knock at the door. I froze. There it was again, another knock, quieter this time. My heart raced. I stood up slowly, creeping towards the door, unsure of who it was. My hand hesitated as I reached for the doorknob. I knew it couldn't be good. When I finally opened it, I saw nothing but the empty hallway outside. I let out a breath of relief, but as I started to close the door, I noticed something strange, a note wedged into the doorframe. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled it out and unfolded it quickly. The words were scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You cannot escape me. I will always find you. You are mine." I felt the blood drain from my face. This was more than just an obsession. This was a threat. But I still wasn't prepared for what would come next. The following days were filled with strange encounters. I began to notice unfamiliar cars parked outside my apartment complex, always at odd hours, always when I was alone. The same car, dark and nondescript, would circle the block a few times before driving away. Every time I left the house, I felt as though someone was watching me. When I went to work, I'd catch glimpses of him in the parking lot, lurking in the shadows, just out of view. I started to become paranoid. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't even leave my apartment without wondering if he was following me. The security cameras around the building were no help. They never caught anything. It felt like he was always one step ahead, always just out of sight. The worst part was that he wasn't just stalking me physically. He was infiltrating my life in every way possible. I started receiving strange, anonymous calls. At first, they were just hang-ups, but eventually, they became taunting. "You think you can get away from me?" the voice would say. "I'm always watching." The most chilling part of it all was when I discovered that he had been keeping tabs on my family as well. My parents began to get strange phone calls, people asking about me and my whereabouts. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake, but when my mom started getting flowers from an unknown sender, I knew something was seriously wrong. The final straw came when I came home one evening to find a letter left on my doorstep. It was a picture of me at a family dinner, taken from a distance. The message was simple but terrifying. "You can't hide. You are always in my sight." I knew then that this was no longer just a broken relationship or a lingering obsession. He had crossed the line into something far more dangerous. This was stalking in its most extreme form, and I had no idea how to make it stop. It all came to a head when my parents called me one evening, their voices trembling with fear. My mom had gone to the door, expecting a delivery, but when she opened it, there was nothing, except for a large, black envelope. Inside it, there was a letter that had been typed out, its tone ominously cold. "I'm coming for you. You can't escape." I could feel the fear in my mother's voice when she relayed the message. She had no idea who could be sending these things, but it was clear that they were not just aimed at me anymore, they were aimed at my entire family. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew that if I didn't act, things could escalate, and I was determined to protect my loved ones from whatever he was planning. That night, I began looking through all the old photos and mementos I had of him. It felt like peeling back layers of an old wound. I had to remember who he really was. I started thinking about the ways he would manipulate me into staying with him for so long. But in the middle of the chaos, something unusual happened. A strange realization struck me. I began to connect the dots. The persistent calls, the notes, the flowers at my parents' house, the sightings near my apartment. Everything was pointing to one thing. He wasn't just stalking me out of obsession. This wasn't just about revenge or love. He wanted control, and in his twisted mind, he believed that controlling me and everyone around me was his right. In a fit of frustration, I decided to do something that I should have done months ago. I called the police. I had all the evidence I could gather, photos of the threatening letters, recordings of the taunting messages, and descriptions of his car and the constant surveillance. They promised me they would take it seriously and began to open an investigation. But as I sat back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. It was only a few days later when I saw him, standing on the corner of my street, waiting. I could feel the tension in the air. It was like time had stopped. He was watching me, his eyes piercing through the darkness. The moment I spotted him, he turned and vanished into the night, leaving me frozen in place. What did he want? Why was he doing this? I didn't have answers, but I knew that he was getting closer. It felt like he was playing a twisted game, and I was the pawn. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the situation had escalated far beyond my control. He wasn't just a vengeful ex, he was a predator, and I was his prey. A few days later, the police informed me of a breakthrough. They had traced his movements, and it turned out he had been actively watching my every move. He had followed me to work, to my parents' house, even to places where I went to escape the constant fear. What shocked me the most was that he had somehow gotten access to my personal details through my old friends and even some of my family. He knew everything. Where I went, who I was with, even what I did on my worst days. And it didn't end there. He had planned to make his move, something that would shatter any hope of me feeling safe again. That's when I found out about the knife. The police had been watching his behavior closely, and they had learned of an incident that had happened a few years ago, an incident that never got reported. He had once shown up at a mutual friend's house, enraged, and brandished a knife. He hadn't hurt anyone, but it was enough to alarm them. He had been escalating for years, and now it seemed like he was ready to act on it. It was then that I knew for sure I had to leave. I had no other choice. I had already taken steps to protect myself, but there was still more to do. I had to make sure that my family and friends were safe, and that included cutting all ties with anyone who might be connected to him. In the aftermath of the police investigation, the weight of everything began to sink in. The constant tension that had lingered in the background of my life was now front and center. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about keeping my family and friends safe. The reality was, I wasn't just dealing with a toxic ex. I was dealing with a man who had lost touch with reality, whose obsession with control had become so warped that he would do anything to claim it. For the first time in years, I felt like I had no space to breathe. Every corner I turned, I expected to find him lurking. It wasn't just the phone calls anymore. It was the threats, public and private, that left me trembling. But the worst part was the realization that, for all this time, I had underestimated his capacity for cruelty. It wasn't just about hurting me, it was about making me feel like I was his to destroy, his to manipulate. The police, though they had gathered evidence and started building a case, were still struggling to find a way to stop him. His stalking had been consistent, but his intentions seemed to grow more erratic by the day. They had him in their sights, but it wasn't enough yet to take legal action. I still had to live in fear that he would strike. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I was sitting in my apartment, lost in thought, when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat, and for a split second, I thought it might be him. I looked through the peephole, and to my shock, it wasn't him. It was someone much more unexpected. It was a delivery. A small, nondescript package with no return address. My hands trembled as I opened it, not knowing what to expect. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was something I had never thought I would see. A photograph of me and him from our younger days. It was one of those moments when everything seemed perfect, a time when we had no idea how much pain would come in the years to follow. But beneath the photograph, there was something else. A knife, similar to the one I had heard about. Its blade gleamed under the light, and for the first time in all of this madness, I felt a new surge of fear. This was no longer just about stalking. It was a threat, one that was becoming too real to ignore. I called the police immediately. They sent over an officer to take the evidence, and within hours, they managed to track down the origin of the package. It led them to a storage facility, one that he had rented out under an alias. There, they uncovered everything. The police recovered several items that painted a chilling picture of his intentions. There were more photographs, dozens of them, hidden in boxes and old bags, each one chronicling every stage of our relationship. But the most disturbing item was a journal he kept, filled with entries describing his obsession with me, how he believed that we were meant to be together, no matter what. His delusions were clear, but the most shocking part was his plan. He had been tracking my every movement, plotting for years to re-enter my life in a way that would ensure my return to him, no matter the cost. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How had I missed it all? The manipulation, the subtle ways he had woven himself back into my life under the guise of a friend. The letters, the flowers, the gifts, it had all been part of his sick plan to break me down emotionally, to wear me down until I was no longer strong enough to resist. But I wasn't the same person I was all those years ago. I had changed, grown stronger. The more I reflected on the pain he had caused me, the more I realized that my decision to break free had been the right one. I had finally taken control of my own life. The police had enough to arrest him, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was over, or so I thought. The moment they took him into custody, I received a call from his lawyer. They offered me a deal, a plea agreement that would let him off with a minimal sentence if I didn't press charges. The lawyer claimed he had issues and needed help. But I knew the truth. His problems weren't something a simple therapy session could fix. He had crossed a line, and no amount of legal wrangling was going to change that. I refused the offer. I was done letting him control my life. The legal proceedings took months, but in the end, justice was served. He was convicted on multiple counts of harassment, stalking, and threats, and he was sentenced to prison time. But the true relief did not come from the verdict. It came from the feeling of liberation. For the first time in years, I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. The knot in my stomach loosened, and the heavy weight on my chest slowly started to lift. Though the scars of what happened would never fully disappear, I knew that I had taken the first step toward healing. I had taken control back, and that made all the difference. If you found this story gripping and want to see more, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.